Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a Encuentros en Mercurio Online, que se transmite cada miércoles a través de MOL TV. Mi nombre es Patricio Fischman, soy director de la Fundación Fundamental, que junto a la Fundación Abayú nos acompañan y apoyan en la actividad de esta tarde. Hoy conversaremos sobre la felicidad, tal como lo hicimos anteriormente, buscando evidencia del desarrollo de la resiliencia y del desarrollo de la espiritualidad. ¿Qué es y cómo vivir con felicidad? Más que un tema, es un campo de estudios y de intervenciones. Es muy relevante para la salud mental y tendremos hoy el privilegio de conversar al respecto con el Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar. Siendo médico psiquiatra, con mucha frecuencia escucho de mis pacientes y de muchas otras personas: yo solo quiero ser feliz, o quiero que mi hijo y mi hija sean felices. Y si bien parecieran frases algo superficiales o frívolas, son en esencia nuestro motor de vida. Es el anhelo que nos brinda un propósito vital. ¿Qué es la felicidad? ¿De qué factores depende la felicidad? Martin Seligman, hace unos 20 años, es el pionero en fundar la psicología positiva, como una rama de la psicología general, pero trascendiendo del usual tratamiento de enfermedades psíquicas para fundar una base de búsqueda de evidencia científica de los factores que generan bienestar y felicidad en las personas. El doctor Tal Ben-Shahar es uno de los científicos que más ha contribuido y más ha trabajado en el campo de los estudios de la felicidad. Él es psicólogo y fue alumno y profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, donde enseñó una de las cátedras más populares, si no la más popular en la historia de esta universidad. Él también es un conferencista internacional y autor de numerosos libros que han sido traducidos a todos los idiomas y leídos por millones de personas. Recientemente, el Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar también ha sido el cofundador de una academia de estudios científicos y multidisciplinarios sobre la felicidad. Well, for our audience, you probably know Tal Ben-Shahar, but Tal, I understand that you studied at Harvard, which is a rather good university. I think it's close to Yale, isn't it?
Yale?
Yeah, it's they're close. And I guess you studied philosophy and psychology and obtained your PhD in organizational behavior. And then you taught probably the largest and most popular classes in the history of the university. Positive psychology and psychology of leadership.
That's right.
Right?
They were the largest courses at the time.
At the time, okay. Well, they've been surpassed. Well, what can we say? You're an author, and I believe that your books have been translated into more than 25 languages, maybe 26 now.
Working on the 27th, Vietnamese.
Okay. And my guess is that above everything else, you're a teacher, and you lecture around the world to people, to executives from multinational companies, to populations at risk, to us. And you lecture on leadership, happiness, ethics, resilience, innovation. What else? What am I missing?
You know, I'll talk about anything to anyone. Whoever is prepared to listen, just give me a topic. I'm happy to speak about it. You know, one of my teachers, a philosophy teacher, when I was in my early 20s, said to me, Tal, you will know that you understand philosophy when you recognize the connection between pizza and politics. And his message is that everything is interconnected.
Well, now that you mentioned that, could you connect me with your barber? Avi, I need a haircut. My wife has been my barber for the last 6 months, and I haven't had the chance to cut my hair. I need a few pieces of advice from Avi. Do you think you can get me an appointment with him?
Yes, as you know, Avi is my barber. He was also my teacher, and I wrote a book about his wisdom. And apropos, everything is interconnected. We can find wisdom about different aspects of our lives in the barber shop, with our friends, in conversation.
Right. Tal, we'll talk about many subjects now, but who are you as a person? Can you tell us who you are, where you come from?
Yeah, so I think probably the characteristic that I see as most important for me and as defining me is that I'm a student. I've always been very curious. I guess I inherited it from my parents, and I've always wanted to learn. I've always been curious about things that are practical, things that I can use. So, even when I went into philosophy, I didn't go into philosophy to understand or gain knowledge for knowledge's sake. I went into philosophy because I thought it was practical. I went into psychology, here it's easier to make the connection, but I went into psychology because I thought it was practical, because I could get answers to real life questions. And specifically, I went into philosophy and psychology because of a simple question that I had, or, why wasn't I happy? And the second question, how could I become happier? And it's in these two disciplines that I first sought the answers. Later on, I realized that in so many other disciplines, whether it's neuroscience, whether it's literature, or whether it's theology, we can find many of the answers.
Sometimes when we are in the road of life, we can look back and see where we have been, where we come from, and things sometimes make sense. Sometimes they don't. What aspects of your life, of where you were born, your family, your parents, you think contributed to the roads that took you where you are?
Yeah, so probably the most defining, well, as for most people, the most defining period is my childhood. And I was raised in Israel, in the city of Ramat Gan, which is just outside Tel Aviv. But I guess you can say that about any city in Israel, just outside Tel Aviv. It's so small. And I was raised in an Orthodox family. So the first book that I read was the Torah, the Bible. And then I studied got a religious education, which I see, until today is a very good foundation, because a lot of the research that I encounter today, I can find a source in the traditional texts, in the traditional books. Then my family moved to South Africa when I was 9 years old. That was also a very defining experience. This was apartheid era South Africa. And, apartheid was primarily, of course, discrimination against the Black and Indian communities in South Africa. However, there was also a great deal of anti-Semitism, which we experienced as children, and I would get into fights almost daily, being called a bloody Jew, and that made me, of course, very unhappy. That was an unhappy period in my life, in my childhood. But I think it also made me tough in some way, because I had to deal with things like that as a child.
Mhm.
We eventually we left South Africa 5 years later, and one of the things that I'd gotten out of that experience, I mean, I got a lot out of it, but one of the things was that I picked up squash as a sport, and that became my life. It was the most. I remember when I was 16, thinking, having the following thought, which was, what am I going to do when I can no longer play squash? You know, what meaning is my life going to have without squash? And I was already planning, what's going to happen when I'm 30 and have to retire. So that was, everything for me.
Let me stop you for just a second. It was your life because you enjoyed it, or it was your life because you were so good about it?
Well, it was, it started actually as me finding refuge. Squash is a sport that you can play by yourself. You can just hit the ball up and down the wall, which is what I did for many, many hours each day. So, living in South Africa, being quite lonely, then it was a refuge. It was something that I could do, and relatively quickly discovered that I could do it quite well.
Okay.
And I became better, and started participating in championships, and that reinforced my desire to continue playing squash. And it was, whenever I went on the court, it felt like I was in flow. I was transcended.
Mm-hmm. I see. And then you became a national champion, didn't you?
Yeah, then when we moved to Israel, I became the national champion at 16. It was also then that I graduated from high school, and had 2 years before I had to enroll in the military in Israel. And I spent those 2 years in Europe, primarily in the UK, where most of the top squash players in the world played. So people came from Pakistan. I played with John Shurkan, who was world champion at the time. Played with British players, with players from India, one or two from Latin America. So we all got there and we trained and played tournaments, traveled around primarily Europe.
Were you proud? Were you happy to be a national champion and playing with the best players of the world?
Yes and no. So yes, I was. I enjoyed the competition. I certainly enjoyed winning. At the same time, there was always a knot in my stomach. So it meant there was stress and pressure that manifested itself physiologically, and it did go away sometimes, but only after a good win, or after an exceptional training session, or something needed to happen for the knot to go away. But even if that something did happen, that knot quite quickly returned. So this period, and I guess my whole childhood was dominated by a few things. First of all, by a very strong ambition. I wanted to do well. I wanted to be the champion. I wanted to be the best student. And at the same time, along with that, or part of it, was also a very strong fear of failure, which I think was responsible for that perpetual knot in the stomach, this constant pressure.
I see. Some people say that happiness is determined, of course, by many factors, but I've seen some equations in which they say that genetics play a role, our hard work, the equipment that we come from the factory with, and then they mention willpower. That seems separate, but somehow I think willpower is also perhaps somewhat inherited. And then they say circumstances of life. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so my take is yes. It's genetics, and it's circumstances, and it's also choices. So I always tell my students that I'm the right person to teach happiness, because I wasn't born with happy genes. So I was born rather with the anxious genes. Again, that not the manifestation of anxiety. And we can trace it back in our family generations and generations, going into our family history. So I did inherit that. I guess there is some genetic element. I guess circumstances added to that. Moving out of my home where I felt very comfortable, in Israel, and going to a place where I didn't know the language. I was a minority and a disliked minority. So of course that had an effect. These are strong circumstances for anyone, certainly for a 9-year-old or a teenager. And then there are choices. And it's like the story of the identical twins who are raised in an abusive family. They have identical circumstances, just about. They have exactly identical genes, and yet one deteriorates and falls, and the other rises and leads an exemplary life. We still have a choice. And I see throughout my life, these points. I mean, at every moment we have a choice, but there are also forks in the road that are more pronounced, where we can really choose: do I go here or there? And that, in the words of Robert Frost, makes all the difference.
And the road less taken as well. Tal, happiness is such an attractive concept. It's magnetic. Sometimes I think of it as a more powerful drive than sexuality itself. It seems as it is at the core of our drives in life. Do you consider seeking happiness as the central drive in our lives?
I certainly do. I subscribe to Aristotle's notion that happiness is the highest end, the end towards which all other ends lead. So yes, of course, sexuality is a powerful force, one of the powerful forces. The question is, why do we want sex? Why do we want relationships? Why do we want to be wealthy? Why do we want to be famous? All these things lead to the ultimate end, because we believe, whether we're right or wrong, but we believe that they will make us happy, that they will contribute to our well-being.
Okay. Well, how would you understand the fact that if we're born with certain predispositions to perhaps be shy, inhibited, a little pessimistic, we could change that, given the fact that some people classify in general our mindset, our psychological functioning, as either constrained or unconstrained. Okay, so we are born with certain temperamental bricks and we cannot change them. These are our flaws. And some other people say, no, of course you can change them. This is just part of you, but you can model and change that. What's your take on that?
Yes. So again, my answer is yes, meaning I think there are certain things that we cannot change. There are certain constraints that are basically part of who we are. And yet there are also many things that we can change. And two things about that. First, so to me, the most hopeful research coming out of the field of the science of happiness is research on neuroplasticity, showing that, yeah, we can change our brain, that it's not fixed. And we can change our brain in significant ways, certainly in ways that make us less anxious or calmer, happier. And yet, Karen Horney, who was a psychoanalyst, a student of Freud in the early part of the 20th century, wrote a lot about neuroses. And what she wrote, and again, she didn't have brain scans then, but she wrote it from experiences, that neuroses never really go away. They can weaken, we can circumvent them, they never really go away. And one of the neuroses that she spoke about was perfectionism. So, if I struggle with perfectionism, my struggle is very different than it was at the age of 16. However, those neural pathways still exist. They're still there. And I still have the inclination to fear failure, to be overly sensitive and defensive. The difference between now and when I was 16 is of course, first of all, awareness. And second, there are alternative neural pathways that I've created over the years, because again, the brain is plastic. And these are neural pathways such as more acceptance and openness towards failure, more acceptance and openness towards imperfection, more acceptance of the and appreciation of life as a whole. And these are things that that were cultivated over time through work.
Well, that's very important, because you're talking about acceptance, which means that if you're really conscious and you search in your mind and you know yourself, and you look into some of the feelings, some of your traits, and you become aware of them, and you tolerate them and you accept them, then maybe you can do terms with them, and then maybe you can work and change them.
Yeah.
But it's a process.
It's a process, and the first step in that process is acceptance. When I started off in this field, I was hoping, okay, I'll know the material so well, and I'll just be able to get rid of perfectionism, or get rid of sadness or anxiety, or whatever it is that I was working with. And I've learned very quickly, whether it's by reading research, but first and foremost from me-search, in other words, from personal experience, that first and foremost, I need to accept the painful, the parts that I don't like. I first need to accept them, embrace them, and then I can move on. One of the poems that speaks very deeply to me is by Rumi, the Sufi poet. And back in the 13th century, he wrote about the guest house. And he wrote about how we should invite as guests all painful emotions, all unwanted thoughts. We shouldn't fight them. We shouldn't reject them. We should bring them in, even the painful ones, because there are messages from the beyond, in his words. And I like that, and I embrace his message.
And you also talk about this pipeline, figuratively speaking, that if you block negative emotions, sadness, anxiety, envy, jealousy, hatred, what happens?
Well, you see, we have one pipeline, and all emotions flow through the same pipeline. There are guests in the same region. And if we block, if we reject one set of emotions, we're inadvertently rejecting all emotions. Golda Meir, Israeli prime minister in the 1970s, once said, "Those who cannot weep with their whole heart cannot laugh either." So it's two sides of the same coin. We need to be able to weep, to laugh. We need to be able to experience sadness if we are really to rejoice. We need to experience envy, experience it if we are to love truly. And experiencing these emotions doesn't mean acting on them. It simply means that, to experience them, to allow them to flow through us.
So one thing is to feel, to think, and something very different is to act. You talk about mindfulness directly and indirectly, and a metaphor comes to my mind about mindful eating. When you look at the shape, the form of what you're eating, the colors, and then the consistency of what you're eating, and the taste, whether it's sour or sweet, or if it's bitter. And if you eat cautiously, then you can taste all those different flavors. And unless you do that, you just swallow and devour everything, and you cannot process it. How difficult it is for us in this hectic cacophony of life, to savor everything, the sour and the sweet.
Yeah, it's interesting you're asking about this, the topic that I'm most engaged by these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying this morning, this is what I read, and what I'm going to read after this conversation is about the slow movement. So the idea of the slow movement was popularized by Carl Honore, who wrote a book in praise of slowness, and also has a very well-known TED lecture. And Carl Honore talks about the slow movement first and foremost in eating. That's where it started, and no big surprise, it started in Italy. He talks about slow living. He talks about slow lovemaking and sex. And he talks about the slow movement in every area of life and how important that is. Because today we're about, fast food. We're about, quickies. We're about fast relationships. And we're not appreciating the depth in each moment, the depth in each bite, the depth of each relationship. And it's unfortunate because life passes us by. As Henry Thoreau, the North American philosopher, wrote back in 1840, that life is too short to be in a hurry. Today, life goes by even faster because the pace of life today is infinitely higher than it was back in the 1840s, and we need to slow down.
You mentioned a few of the ingredients that this very complex mixed stew of happiness need to have. And you talk about simplifying, which has to do with what you're saying. And you bring up an incredible example about liking Whitney Houston and Beethoven. I don't know if you can tell us more about that.
Sure. So, my favorite song in the world is Whitney Houston. My second most favorite piece of music is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And I really enjoy listening to both pieces of music. However, what if I brought the two together? What if I tried to listen to them as one? Because I wanted to get more done, be more efficient, not waste my time, quote unquote, first listening to that and then to that. Well, what I would have is not double the pleasure. I will have much more than double the pain, because it will be cacophonous. In other words, when we want to enjoy something truly, we need to be focused on it. In other words, we need to introduce more single tasking into our lives rather than multitasking. And this is not the way most people live life today. We are trying to do more and more things in less and less time. And we end up not enjoying, not deriving pleasure from anything. I think about even meals with families or with our friends. I so often see people, on the phone at the same time, or, the TVs on in the background. And we fail to derive maximum pleasure and joy and meaning from these inherently joyful, pleasurable, and meaningful experiences because we're bringing too much into the experience. Simplify, slow down. I think that should be the mantra of modern day living.
What role do expectations play in this process?
So I'm often asked, what did you learn that is new today that you knew, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was teaching the class at Harvard for the first time? So what's new in your world? And what's new is something that is old. And what's new is my relationship to expectations. So in the past, and not so distant past for me, I thought that high expectations were good, period. After all, I knew about all the research on the Pygmalion in the classroom, for instance. Have high expectations of students and they will live up to your expectations. Low expectations, they will underperform. I know about the expectations for athletes. A lot of research showing that high expectations will lead to more success in the long term. So everywhere I looked, high expectations was good. Over the years, I've realized that our understanding of expectations needs to be a little bit more nuanced, especially when it comes to happiness. Because having high expectations in regards to happiness is not necessarily a prescription for happiness. With success, yes. With happiness, not so. What we need with happiness is realistic expectations. So for instance, if my expectation is that once I become an expert in happiness, I will be happy all the time. I will experience a constant high. My life will be devoid of sadness or anger or disappointment or envy or frustration. If that is my expectation, I'm inevitably going to be disappointed and frustrated. Not only that, all these painful emotions will only intensify and I'll have more of them. You know, in Buddhism, in Judaism, and today in modern research, there's a lot of talk about two levels of suffering. The first level of suffering is suffering that we all experience on a day-to-day basis. There are difficulties, there are hardships, there are disappointments, frustrations. It's natural. That's the first level. That's inevitable. The second level of suffering comes when we reject the first level. When I say to myself something like, hey, you're an expert on happiness, you shouldn't be anxious. Hey, you're a good person, you shouldn't be envious of your best friend. When I say these things to myself, then the level of suffering intensifies, it grows. This is the second level, and this is not inevitable. Here we have a choice. Do we accept and embrace the first level, or do we reject it?
I see.
And that has to do with expectation. Do I expect a constant high? Do I expect a life devoid of anxiety? If I do, I'm subjecting myself to unhappiness. Or I go into a relationship and my expectation from the relationship is that we'll live happily ever after, just like they do in fairy tales. Well, I'm bound to be disappointed because in every relationship, after the honeymoon phase, that is, there's bound to be conflict and disappointment and frustration and anger. It's part and parcel of the best of relationships. And if my expectation is that my relationship will be devoid of it, or if our expectation is that we're bound to be disappointed, frustrated, and unhappy.
There are different terrains, so to speak, of people that receive the seeds of expectation. You know, we have world leaders, marketing, social networks that create expectation. Social networks know what you want. Political leaders need your vote, and they send the seeds to be planted. Why is it that some people are fertile ground for those seeds of expectations to flourish, and they follow those expectations, be them realistic or not. And some other people are ambitious, but ambitious not only in growing rich, but also stronger psychologically, physically, spiritually. And they seem to have sort of an internal locus of control, whereas the other people are still depending on the expectations that are self.
Well, Patricio, you do depict two groups, and the two groups exist. However, I think that the group that falls for high expectations is much, much greater than the group that does not. I think most of us, at least some of the time, no, I would actually generalize here. I would say all of us, some of the time, fall into the trap of too high expectations. Why? Because it feels good. Why? Because we want to believe it. I mean, who doesn't want to believe in fairy tales? I mean, who doesn't want to live happily ever after? Who doesn't want to experience constant calm and contentment? This is why we're so attracted. This is to the self-help movement or the New Age movement. This is what these books promise us, the 5 steps, and then you will be
Right.
like me, who's on the cover of the New York Times bestseller with my perfect smile. Or you will be
Right.
like the person that you see on social media, who's always happy and has the best relationships, and even during quarantine is flourishing and thriving as they learn how to cook and how to be even more intimate with their perfect partner and family. We want these things. They appeal to us. They appeal to something which is very primal. What's people's attraction to religion in general? Because we want something that is perfect. Now, for some people, that yearning for perfection is stronger than others. Some people mature. I mean, what is one sign of maturity? One sign of maturity is when we realize that our parents are not perfect. And it hurts when we realize it. But that is a sign of maturity. Another sign of maturity is that we will never be perfect, or that our relationship will never be perfect. That often happens after midlife crisis. So, at different times, we grow, we mature when we let go of this perfect notion of these great expectations.
But how can we let go of that if perfectionism and seeking perfection is the antidote to uncertainty and anxiety? I need a powerful father, a powerful president. I need God. And I need to believe that. How can I let that go? I need those expectations.
Yeah, we do need those expectations, and we can still let them go. And when we let them go, it hurts. There are growing pains associated with that. And not only at one point, okay, and I've let it go, and now I'm feeling all great for the rest of my life. It's about accepting the fact that we will continuously experience pain because that perfection doesn't exist. And that is part of the human condition. The reason why in the research on happiness, we see a U shape. And that U shape is that, when we're, in our 20s, we're ambitious, things are going great. And then the happiness actually goes down and down and down. And on average, the worst place is around late 40s. Again, that's on average. It doesn't mean that it's for everyone. But then we become happier as we grow older. Why? Because as we grow older, we become more accepting. What usually happens in our mid to late 40s is that break that we realize, well, I won't be able to have it all. Not all the dreams that I had as a 3-year-old or as a 30-year-old will come true. I will not have that perfect life, relationship, world. And then later on we say, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that I cannot make a difference, that I cannot make a difference in my life, in others' life. It doesn't mean that I cannot lead a meaningful life. I can, not a perfect life, but a meaningful life. And then we come to terms with this imperfection. And again, we accept, we embrace.
How can you understand some of the social crises going on, not only in Chile and in other countries, when, of course, political leaders can take advantage of what they think and what they say, but there's an underlying river of inequality and high expectations. And that leads to a feeling, on the one hand, of entitlement. Why is it that me, I'm a psychiatrist, and why is it that I am not world famous like you? Why is it that you're an author and you've written so many books? Why is it that you're so wise, like my daughter Ronit, who's a psychologist, and told me yesterday that Tal is great. I just love what he teaches us. And I felt terribly envious. And why is it that I cannot be equal to you? Why is it that I have high expectations that will never be met?
Let me share with you a story, which I think is the best lesson that I learned about raising children. And So David is our eldest son. He's just turned 16. He was born in Boston. He was born at 1 a.m. And at around 7 a.m., our doctor comes into the room, checks up on Tammy, my wife, checks up on David. For some reason, he doesn't check up on me. They were doing just great. And then he leaves the room. But before he leaves, he says one more thing. He says, over the next few months, you're going to experience every single kind of emotion to the extreme. You're going to experience extreme joy and extreme frustration, extreme anxiety and extreme love, everything to the extreme. And he said, it's fine, it's normal, we all go through it. And he left. And it was the best advice that I got about child rearing and also beyond child rearing. Why? Because after about a month, I started to feel some envy towards David. Why? Because for the first time since my wife and I had been together, and we had been together since the age of 14, for the first time, here was someone who was getting more attention than I was, no matter how much I cried. Now, normally I would say to myself, Tal, that's terrible. What a hypocrite. You feel envious towards your own flesh and blood? But because I had the doctor's voice in my head, saying it's fine, it's natural, we all go through it, giving me the permission to be human, I allowed that emotion to flow through me and then could choose the most appropriate course of action.
Okay.
And
so you're telling me that I can be envious and at the same time admire you as a person and a professional and care for you at the same time? Can I simultaneously feel all those?
I'm saying more than that. I'm saying that you'll inevitably feel envious towards some people. You know, I feel envious sometimes towards my students. You know, I see some of my students who are incredibly successful or have an incredible, fill in the blank. And I say, why don't I have that? Again, the difference between the way I saw it in the past and the way, I see it today is that in the past, I would say to myself, Paul, you shouldn't have these emotions. In other words, reject them. In other words, second level of suffering. Whereas now I look at these emotions and I say, oh, I'm human. How nice. And you've heard me say this before. I always joke that there are only two kinds of people. Well, it's actually not a joke. There are two kinds of people who don't experience painful emotions: psychopaths and dead people. And I really say to myself, even today, wow, great. I'm not a psychopath and I'm alive. So I, in a way, I even make a little bit of fun of the experience, even though, don't get me wrong, it's not fun for me to experience envy toward my, baby boy or towards a student or a best friend. However, it's about having realistic expectations. I'm a human being, and therefore I'll continue to experience, for as long as I live, envy and anxiety and sadness and frustration and anger and disappointment. These are all human emotions.
If you're able to identify those emotions and you're able to tolerate them and accept them and then process them, does that mean that you're able to forgive people as well? Are those ingredients important in that process?
Yeah. Yes, I didn't make this connection to forgiveness. I think you're spot on. Why? Because how we treat others is very often a reflection of how we treat ourselves. So my perfectionism, yes, it hurt me a great deal, certainly as a child and growing up. It didn't just hurt me, it also hurt the people closest to me, because these were also my expectations from them. Unrealistic, unfair expectations. So if I'm more forgiving and more accepting towards myself, yes, of course, I will also be more accepting and more forgiving of others.
And will that process also help us, that process of becoming aware and tolerating, accepting, coming to terms with it, will it help us be more grateful?
Yes, and So being more accepting, more tolerant will absolutely help us be more grateful. And being more grateful will also help us being more tolerant. So one of the antidotes, as I see it, to perfectionism, to unrealistic high expectations, is appreciation. This is why I'm a big fan of a very simple and well-known exercise, which is expressing gratitude. And I do it every night before going to bed. Express gratitude, even if I've had the worst of days. I still find things to be grateful for. And again, this going back to my upbringing in Judaism. The first word that you say in the morning is grateful. It's a prayer. Modeh, grateful I am. It's not I am grateful. You say grateful I am. So the powers that be that created this prayer wanted us to first say gratitude before we say the I.
You speak about meaning, which is another very important meaning and purpose, another very important ingredient in this happiness trail that we're all in. And you talk about capital M, lofty ideals, God, and you talk about the small m's. Can you illustrate us more about that?
Yeah, the capital M, small m meaning is introduced by Viktor Frankl in the book, probably the first book that I would recommend anyone, Man's Search for Meaning, a book that certainly had a very deep and profound effect on me as on many other people. And the distinction he makes between capital M and small m meaning is between the meaning of life, that would be capital M, and the meaning in life. Now, the meaning of life for many people comes through religion. It comes, their desire to make the world a better place, to end poverty, to, overcome discrimination, whatever it is. That is the big M meaning, the meaning of life. And yet, it's not enough. And very often it doesn't even exist, but even if it does exist, it's not enough to sustain the day-to-day. We need the meaning in life. And that is the meaning in a conversation we have with a friend, meaning in the work that we do day in and day out. It's about finding meaning in our interaction with our family members, finding meaning in appreciating a plant or a flower. And it's these small experiences of meaning that add up and fill our lives with meaning. So ideally, we have the meaning of life, something, a goal that we aspire to, a big goal. However, even if we do have that, we also need the small goals, the small objectives, the moment by moment appreciation, the meaning that is inherent in what we do.
That's so very important. I think I told you that a few weeks ago I had a conversation with Edith Eger, who is a Hungarian-American psychologist who survived Auschwitz. And she mentioned, well, also being a disciple of Viktor Frankl, that her meaning in order to survive was being able to make it through the day, seeing another sunrise. That kept her alive, and she was able to survive.
Sometimes when we are in danger, our automatic mechanism, an internal mechanism, kicks in, and we look for small wins, for small meaningful experiences, because these are the things that will sustain us. Paradoxically, very often when we seemingly have it all, it is much more difficult to find those small meanings, those tiny appreciations. Why? Because the voice in our head tells us, how come you're not happy? You have everything. You have, look, in the middle of a pandemic, you have food on your table, you have some level of security. How come you're not happy? How come you're feeling a sense of meaninglessness?
Right.
And then we don't give ourselves the permission to look for meaning in the small things, in the trivial things. And yet, these things are important for a person who's struggling and for a person who, at least from the outside, seems to be doing great.
When we think about Viktor Frankl and Edith Eger, we think about resilience, and you talk about resilience a lot. And there's another term that came into the discussion which is anti-fragility, which speaks about something above and beyond resilience. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Yeah, the topic of anti-fragility is something that I've been exploring a lot since COVID-19, since the pandemic. You know, anti-fragility is a term that was coined by Nassim Taleb, who's a professor from NYU, originally from Lebanon. And anti-fragility is essentially what I've come to see as resilience 2.0. So resilience 1.0 is the ability to bounce back. Resilience 2.0 is the ability to bounce back higher. In other words, it's about growing stronger from hardship, not simply recovering and going back to where we were. It's about growing stronger, better, happier, healthier as a result of our system being challenged. In the same way, for example, in anti-fragile processes, when we are working out in the gym, we work out in the gym, we put pressure, stress on our muscles, and they grow stronger as a result of this pressure and stress. This is an anti-fragile system. And as I see it, the whole field of happiness studies is about creating the conditions for anti-fragility. Nothing can ensure anti-fragility. Sometimes we break, but we can enhance the likelihood that we psychologically will be anti-fragile, that our families will be anti-fragile, that our organizations and ultimately nations will be anti-fragile. In other words, that they will grow from hardship rather than break as a result.
Excellent. It's a wonderful example, because when you go to the gym and you're an athlete, you break down muscle fibers.
Exactly.
There's destruction of muscle fibers. There's pain. And then they grow, they multiply and they grow. And I think the same thing happens even from a neurobiological standpoint. You know, you were talking about circuits. We have antique circuits going there, but we build new circuits, and they come from hardship. They come from pain. They come from emotional pain. And you not only survive, you're not only resilient, you become stronger at facing other hardships in life. And I love the concept of anti-fragility. Is that something you're working on now, that you're writing about?
Yes, so I'm writing a book about happiness in difficult times, because many people have a misunderstanding of the field of happiness studies, thinking that it's just a luxury. It's just a field that's good for good times. Whereas the point that I'm making is that it's very much about strengthening us during difficult times as well. And happiness, or rather a happy life, as I mentioned, is not a life devoid of pain. A happy life is a life where we embrace, where we invite the painful emotions, painful thoughts as guests.
I see. Well, that's a very important point, because having been trained in psychodynamic therapy and psychopharmacology, when positive psychology came to being, late 1990s, Martin Seligman, it opened a new window into working with your mind without having to be ill, without having a DSM diagnosis. But then one of the risks that I saw in that is that it was cornered for the well-being of people, just for those who were normal and wanted to be stronger. Is there a role of positive psychology in people that have neurobiological problems that will benefit from CBT? Is there a role in those people as well?
So I think there is a role. However, however, it's very important. This is important for practitioners, whether they're positive psychologists or not, to understand positive psychology doesn't have all the answers. The science of happiness is not a panacea that can solve and resolve all issues. What it does do is it provides additional tools for the toolkit, whether it's of the therapist and whether it's of the expert in CBT or transpersonal psychologist or psychoanalyst. It provides important tools and techniques that can be used as well. It's not a standalone, it doesn't solve all the problems. The way I see it is, and I hope the way this is where psychology is going, that there wouldn't be a positive psychology, because that implies a negative psychology. I would like all the tools that are coming out of positive psychology to simply become part and parcel of this field of psychology. And this is what I teach as well, whether it's a class on positive psychology at Harvard, or whether it's the certificate in happiness studies through the Happiness Studies Academy. I bring these ideas from the different disciplines. Yes, from positive psychology, and from the work of Karen Horney, who was a psychoanalyst, and from the work of Viktor Frankl, who was a logotherapist, and from the work of Lao Tzu, who was a philosopher. Again, everything is interconnected, and we can look at each phenomenon from different perspectives. And the more perspectives we have, the more awareness, understanding we have, and therefore the more insight and ways in that we have.
Such a wonderful way of summarizing that. As human beings, we are compartmentalized. It's like this is the neurologist, the psychologist, the psychiatrist, the sociologist. This is CBT, this is psychoanalysis. And it's like we have so much difficulty in this struggle of integrating things. I must confess that many patients that I see are receiving medication from me, some sort of psychotherapy, but it's seldom that someone leaves my office without a recommendation for physical exercise, good nutrition, good sleep, meditation. Find spirituality. I don't know if you're going to pray to the east or to the west or to the cross. Why can that not be integrated in general?
I couldn't agree more. You know, one of the turning points, you know, we talked at the beginning about how there are certain forks in the road less taken. So one of my forks in the road happened 5 years ago. And I was on a flight. I used to be on many flights, not anymore, at least not for a while. And I was on a flight and feeling very tired and, you know, just about to fall asleep, but too uncomfortable to fall asleep. And suddenly a question came to mind. And the question was, how is it that there is a field of study for psychology, for philosophy, there's a field for history, economics, business, medicine, you name it, but there is no field of study for happiness. So yeah, there is positive psychology, but that's just the psychology of happiness. What about what philosophers had to say about happiness, like Lao Tzu and Aristotle? What about what theologians had to say about happiness, the different religions? What about what economists and writers like Marianne Evans and Shakespeare, Chinua Achebe? What about what films can teach us about happiness? And I resolved at that moment to help create a field, an interdisciplinary field of studies that looks at happiness from the perspective of psychology, of course, and philosophy and history. And by the way, in psychology, not just positive psychology, also psychoanalysis and transpersonal and humanistic. And
Absolutely.
from the perspective of economics and literature and neuroscience and so on.
Do you think there's a link between being happy and being peaceful, peace of mind? And then I'll tell you why.
Yes, there is a connection. And I think most people, I certainly did, have a fantasy that they can reach nirvana, total contentment and peace. To be honest, I don't think it's possible. I think that it is an unrealistic expectation. That yes, there are sometimes when we navigate through life, we go through quiet waters, but very often we also go through treacherous waters and through storms, and they're inevitable. So maybe if we go on and meditate, 8 hours a day in the Himalayas, away from the world, or at least most of the world, then maybe we can experience more nirvana and more calm and more peace than we can when we go to work, every day, and when we have a family and relationships and politics on our minds and hearts. But I really don't think it is realistic to experience this constant peace. What I do think and believe is that we can experience peace more of the time. That we can, and this is part of becoming happier. It's like when people ask me, Tal, are you happy? My answer is, well, I'm happier today than I was 30 years ago. I certainly hope to be happier, 10 years from now. So it's a process, and it's the same with peace. We can experience more peace than we experienced 10 years ago, and we can strive for more and more peace as we grow, as we mature.
Sometimes, even if it's not realistic and we may not see it in our lifetime, the struggle to find meaning in trying to, for instance, research and intervene in the factors that lead to a child's good mental health and therefore peace of mind and therefore a good way of relating to the world, to the family, to the community, and even in between communities that are rival. It's a goal of people that are scientists that are studying into which factors can be stimulated so that the child can become healthier and a bearer of peace. As you say, it's very difficult. Probably we're not going to get there, but the process itself is so meaningful, and many people are involved in doing that.
Yeah, when it comes to raising children, when it comes to developmental psychology, one of the people I very often turn to is Donald Winnicott, the British child psychologist. And Donald Winnicott talked about the importance of the good enough mother.
Right.
Now, he talked about the mother because in the 50s, when he wrote, it was mostly the mother who took care of the children. But today, more and more fathers, thankfully, are involved in raising children. So his idea of the good enough mother certainly applies to the good enough father as well. And I think it is such an important concept on so many levels. First of all, in terms of expectations, the expectations shouldn't be to be the perfect parent where you do raise your child so that they become, perfect adults. The expectation is that good enough is good enough. But the other reason why he talks about good enough is because he says, what would a perfect parent look like? Would it be a parent that is always perfectly attentive to the child's needs and wants? Is that a perfect parent? Well, would that child grow up to be a mature adult who is able to deal with hardships and difficulties if all their needs are catered for perfectly by their parent? Probably not. In other words, even when parents make mistakes, these mistakes potentially can turn into learning experiences for the child. So I don't know if such a thing as a perfect parent even exists. Because if it did, it wouldn't be perfect. It's an inherent contradiction, because you want your child to struggle. You want your child to go through hardship. In the words of another great educator, Maria Montessori, you don't want to do for your child what the child can do for him or herself. In other words, if the child can struggle through pain and overcome that pain themselves, you don't want to resolve it for them. You want them to go through it. If your child has a conflict in school and the child can solve it themselves, you want your child to solve it. You don't want to do it for them, to be that helicopter parent that takes care of everything. That's unhealthy. So the good enough mark for me is it's not a map towards being a good parent, but it's a compass. You know, a map would tell you exactly what to do. A compass would give you a sense of direction. Excellent. So yes, be good, be generous, be accepting, be embracing. Above everything, be loving, or below everything, be loving. And also be more forgiving towards yourself and towards your children. And I think this is the role model that children need.
What's the role of service in helping other people? Could we teach those children you're talking about not to just look after themselves, but also to help others?
Yes, and there are two primary ways of doing it. And first of all, why yes? Because helping others makes the world a better place. And that's certainly an important goal and objective for us as individuals, as far as I see it, for the field of happiness studies or psychotherapy. In addition, one of the most direct and powerful paths to happiness is by helping others. In other words, helping others is also about helping ourselves. They are two sides of the same coin. And that's an important topic to bring up in today's culture. Because in today's culture, there's a very clear schism, break between helping oneself and helping others. You know, you look at the word selfishness. You look at the word selfishness, you open the thesaurus and you look for words that mean the same thing as selfishness. And what do you find in the thesaurus? You find words such as bad, evil, self-interested, inconsiderate, harmful, immoral. These are the words that are associated with selfishness. On the other hand, you look at selflessness, and what words are associated with that? Moral, kind, nice, generous, good. Now, when you are immersed in this culture, and in our culture, selfishness is associated with negative things, selflessness with positive things, you say to yourself, I don't want to be all these negative things. I want to be moral, good, and therefore I need to be selfless. But there is an inherent contradiction here, because by our nature, part of our nature at least, is selfish. I mean, even the field of happiness studies is about striving for my happiness. So should I feel guilty about it because I'm being selfish? The answer is absolutely not. What we need to do is change the cultural understanding, the cultural schema that we have regarding selfishness, regarding striving towards a better life. For me, it's not a bad thing. On the contrary, because when I increase my levels of happiness, what I'm doing is I'm also becoming more generous, kinder. There is a very clear connection, and the research shows it, and we don't need research. When I increase my levels of well-being, when I feel good about myself, I'm more likely to contribute to others, to help others. In turn, when I help others, I'm also more likely to help myself to feel better. And when I feel better, I'm more likely to help others feel better, and on in an upward potential, upward spiral of generosity. Rather than thinking about selfishness or selflessness, what I strongly urge people to do is think about self-fullness, which is about the integration of helping oneself and helping others. And in our traditions, we see this connection being made very clearly. For example, in Hebrew, which is my mother tongue, the word for give is Natan. Natan, the name Nathan comes from Natan.
Right.
Natan, what's unique about it is that it's a palindrome, meaning it's read the same left to right and right to left. Natan, or in Hebrew, nun taf nun. And there is a very strong message here that says that when we give, we also receive. When we receive, we also give. There are two sides of the same coin. You look at the foundation of most religions, whether it's certainly the, well, not only, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, the
Right.
foundation is the golden rule. And the golden rule is something to the effect of, or a variation of, do not do unto others what you would not do unto yourself, or love thy neighbor as you love thyself. What is the foundation of that?
Right.
Self-love. There is nothing wrong with that. It is the foundation of the love of others. There are two sides of the same coin.
Wonderful.
It's about selffulness.
Wonderful. It's so difficult to integrate things, but I'm going to challenge you. Can you tell me your free associations if I mention God, death, and legacy?
Independently or all at once?
Oh, it's more difficult all at once.
All at once. Well, I asked for it, right? I said that everything is interdependent. So
Right.
God, death, and legacy.
And legacy, right.
The moment. Why the moment? Because in the moment, we have the potential for eternity. Because in the moment, everything comes together. The past, our aspirations to the future, our fears, our hopes, everything comes together into this moment. So in this moment of eternity, we do bring it all together.
Wonderful. Since we are starting to end our conversation, and again, there's always this feeling of loss that comes about with separations, with death, and our need to perpetuate our lives. Like, for example, I'd like to have you insert a little file in your brain with our experience today so that it's there. So when we say goodbye, I'll have a sense that I continue to live in your mind. And when I'll die, I'd like to think whether I'm going to go to heaven or that in the minds of other people, there will be a little file that will say Patricio or Dr. Fischman. The last word was legacy. What would you like to leave here as a mark in the world when you're not here?
For people to be more accepting of their own humanity and of others' humanity, to truly give themselves and others the permission to be human.
That's great, Tal. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your sharing with us this time and your knowledge and your wisdom. And for the last little message for our audience, people in Chile, like everywhere else in the world, going through these very, very difficult times, if you could just leave us with a final message.
The final message is a message, and I'm going to go cliche here. It's the message of hope. And the reason is because the difference between sadness and depression is that depression is sadness without hope. So hope is extremely important, and there is really place for hope. because we are a lot stronger than we think, because by our nature, we are anti-fragile. And what we need to do is simply, or not so simply, create the conditions, put them in place so that we can grow from this hardship or any other hardship that we experience in our lives. Just like muscles grow from difficulties, so can our psychological well-being. And these conditions, first and for anti-fragility, include things like allowing the free flow of emotions. They include spending time with people we care about and who care about us. And another condition is finding meaning, whether it's the meaning of life or the meaning in the day-to-day, learning to appreciate the small, significant, and potentially life-changing things that happen, that unfold at every minute within us and around us.
Tal, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and hope with us.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.